get into my four sort of points on
Mm-hmm.
the problem of evil.
Yeah,
So
let's do it.
the first one is what I call the problem of shared axiology, right? So what does this mean? Well, I went over this in my debate, but I guess just briefly summarizing here. So in order for the problem of evil to get off the ground, it has to assume an axiology, right? It's going to have to like assume a more fundamental value theory, or what I call value assumptions, or a set of value assumptions, right? And I mean, and I think this is pretty obvious. I mean, if you're gonna state, okay, there's this bad states of affairs that God would not allow, well, you're gonna have to assume an axiology there. You're going to have to assume that these actually are bad states of affairs in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, in order for the problem of evil to actually get off the ground, you're going to have to assume a value theory. You're going to have to assume um, that there is this sort of set of values that God is constrained by, and then if God, if God violates those, sets, then that would sort of falsify theism, right? Because on theism, God can only do good things, right? That's the whole idea.
Mm-hmm.
God is all good. He can only do good things. Therefore, given a certain value theory, God can only do what is according to the value theory, right?
Yeah.
Um, but the problem here is that there are a plurality of different value theories, right? There's virtue ethics, there's utilitarianism, there's consequentialism, right? There's deontology. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the problem of evil won't work. It just pointed out here that if God is constrained by, let's say, virtue ethics, right, where God is sort of motivated to sort of produce virtues, right, and if virtues
Mm-hmm.
require certain suffering, then it just logically follows that God's going to have to, according to the value theory, going to have to allow for a certain amount of suffering to occur, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, and I think another consideration here, I'll get more into this when I get into the next point, which is the defeat condition. But the whole idea is you want to, that sort of lays out the game, right? Because it's like, okay, well, if you're gonna come up with an argument from evil, you're gonna say, well, God would create a world that is perfect, right? This is the
Mm-hmm.
imperfection argument. Since we live in an imperfect world, and therefore God would not do that, right? And the issue that I see there is that you're going to have to make a lot of assumptions about what is perfect and what's not perfect, right? And you're also going to have to make a lot of assumptions about what type of world are we actually judging here when it comes to what's perfect and what's not perfect, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this gets into the problem of what I call incrementability, right? And this
Yeah.
basic idea is that there are certain values in our world that you can't really compare to, like, I don't know, the value of like an angelic world or something, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you're gonna have this incrementability going on. So it's not like there's this universal set of like, okay, these are like the best values that could occur in any possible state of affairs, and then you have these lower levels. Like, no, I think there are sort of like, they're incrementable. Like you can't really measure them, so to speak,
Yeah.
right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think so. Given that sort of problem, then and this, I think this is relevant to the shared axiology, because the axiology is also going to sort of have this incrementability issue, right? And there's a good paper by I forgot his name. I think it's Rubio something, but he talks about how any world that God creates, there could always be a better world, right? And
Mm-hmm.
a better world and a better world. And it's like, okay, well, you're going to run into this paradox where God just can't create any world, because any world that God creates, God could just create a better one.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in that case, given this sort of axiology there, then there's going to be um, a circumstance by which, because God cannot create the perfect world, because that's just metaphysically impossible, then there's going to be sort of the next best state of actions that God can do is going to be an imperfect world, right?
Yeah.
um Now, me and Tim, I know in our last rebuttal to Ben Watkins, we sort of pointed this out. And the basic idea here is that there's going to be, because of that incrementability problem, and given this sort of hierarchy of, God could just always create the next best world, um, then you run into this issue where either God creates no world, or God creates an imperfect world. And what I mean by imperfect world is that just to be clear here, that an imperfect world, when I mean that, is that it's incommensurable. So while it is true that God can only create the best world, that best world is going to be incommensurable to some other best world, right? In terms of value, right? Because you can't really measure them, right? And so because of that leaves a lot of that leaves a lot of problems, because I see what a lot of arguments from evil they sort of do is they sort of assume one set of incommensurable values, but then they have to ignore this other set of incommensurable values that God may be, more obligated or more motivated to act by, right? So I hope that helps in terms of the axiology. And then I guess, well, my next point will probably be more relevant to this.